Welcome to this mini lecture on the achievement gap, sometimes called the education gap. We'll begin by answering the question of what the achievement gap is, then we'll pull in some data to help us make sense of the topic. So, what is the achievement gap? The achievement gap refers to the disparities in academic outcomes for different groups of students. These outcomes are usually high-stakes test scores, such as the SOL tests in Virginia, or maybe the SAT or ACT tests you may have taken to get into VCU. Many education scholars argue that the American education system works to reinforce rather than overcome our differences by using these test scores. In this mini lecture, we'll look at three different categories that the achievement gap uses: race, gender, and socioeconomic status, or SES. There are many cultural and social factors that influence a student's achievement, but here we're focusing on these three: race, SES, and gender, because these three categories are often used alone or in combination to describe large groups of students. Let's take a look at some data in Virginia that illustrate the achievement gap. This information came from the Virginia Department of Education website listed at the bottom of the slide. In the first table, I ran data on males in Richmond by race and SES, and I looked at passing rates for the algebra SOL. The passing rate for white males was about 28 points higher than for black males. Now let's add the same data from one of Virginia's wealthiest counties, Loudoun. Here again, we can see a gap between race, with white males in Loudoun outperforming black males by about 19 points. There is less of a gap between white Richmond and white Loudoun males. This website allows you to choose the categories and school divisions you want to research, and I encourage you to visit this site if you are pursuing an education degree, or perhaps you want to do your course project on the achievement gap. These examples here are to show you that the gap is real and it exists. If you randomly selected different data, you would likely see the achievement gap trend by race, gender, and SES. Let's look at some ways that the education gap works. School districts use data to group and norm different categories of students. For example, white girls or black boys, SES disadvantaged students, English learners, etc., against a normative standard, and then school systems treat these groups accordingly. The achievement gap is a complex phenomenon and difficult to describe in terms of direct cause and effect. We know that being categorized in a certain way can have real lived experiences for individuals. Let's look at one example from the 2017 National Center for Education Statistics report on race indicators. Take a moment to read this data. Does this data conform to any stereotypes you have about these groups of students? Do you identify as one of these groups? If so, how does this make you feel? Let's look at another example from the same source. take a moment to read this data. Do you identify with any of these groups? If so, how does it make you feel? My goal in sharing this information is not to piss you off, but to show you some examples of real-world data that educators use to make policy, inform instruction, and train teachers. So how do educators use this data to inform policy and instruction? Here are some examples. Tracking. You may already know what this is because you were probably on the high academic track or college prep track in high school because you're here now at VCU. Data are used to place students into different academic tracks, which are then very difficult to jump out of. Tracks are sometimes synonymous with high, advanced placement, more rigorous and difficult, or maybe low, remedial, basic, less college prep emphasis. Ability grouping refers to a design strategy that places students with similar skills together. This often results in less rigorous instruction and lower expectations for students who are thought to have quote-unquote lower skills. Data are also used to inform discipline policies, which disproportionately target some groups more than others. Taken together, these practices can lead to a negative school climate, which makes it undesirable for the most experienced and talented teachers. Low-performing schools are often short-staffed or staffed by inexperienced and new teachers. I hope you can see a trend that data, which are organized around the categories of race, SES, and gender of student groups, can work to segregate student groups more and more. The quote-unquote great equalizer of education can reinforce our differences. So what can we do? How do we disrupt the workings of the achievement gap? These are big questions over which educators, scholars, and political leaders often disagree. For our purposes in this class, it's important to have a critical awareness of what the achievement gap is and its implications for different demographic groups of students. I'm going to end this mini lecture and direct you to some background reading. Then I invite you to view the short video Brooklyn Brownstone, which tells the story of two New York City schools and their efforts to close the gap. I think you will find this content very interesting. Enjoy.